All right, as I say, one of the projects of Entanglements is to, um, or one of the commitments of Entanglements, a system of philosophy, um, is to defending the real world. Right? Um, you wouldn't think the real world needs much defense, but I'll tell you this, man. I think the real world has suffered terribly at the hands of philosophers. Like stuff we all believe is true, stuff we all know very well, stuff we all experience every day. Philosophers throw it into doubt, reimagine it or reconstrue it so that it's about reduces to sense contents or is difficult to distinguish from a hallucination or a dream, for example. Don't let philosophers take away the real world, and actually they're sort of messing with it. I think has been sort of a millennia-long train wreck because no one believes that shit anyway. Anyway, all right. So I propose to prove that the external world exists. And actually, I'm just going to swipe somebody's proof. That is G.E. Moore, in one of the great moments in the history of philosophy, one of the most profound moments, one of the most decisive moments, refuted skepticism about the external world. Thus, here is a hand, and here is another. All right, so if it's true that here is a hand and here is another, then there are things external to the mind, namely hands. All right, so, don't do this with me on YouTube or whatever. I mean, this is just an image of a hand that you're experiencing. But do it in your very own living room. Look at your hands and say, those damn things are external to my mind, whatever my mind is. No, I propose this is decisive proof, or I play with that quite a bit in the chapter on epistemology, the fourth chapter of, is it the fourth? No, it's the third chapter of Entanglements, a system of philosophy. And one thing I'll tell you who was obsessed with Moore's proof, and that is Ludwig Wittgenstein. Really for decades, I think, in Wittgenstein's mind, the dialogue with Moore on this matter and others, but on this matter in particular, drove Wittgenstein's thinking in a variety of ways. I think that's appropriate because I think Moore, at this moment, is unbelievably underrated philosopher, especially outside of his ethics, which is still read, as well it should be. I'll talk about that in a later, that comes up in a later chapter. All right, now, so Wittgenstein wrestles with the Moore's proof of the external world throughout the notes that became uncertainty, or the slips, or whatever they were originally, that became uncertainty, one of the last things published. Although I guess there's been many rejiggering since of all kinds of Wittgenstein notes and so on. So, he says this kind of stuff in uncertainty. Directly addressing Moore's here's a hand and here's another. Of course, Moore actually gave many, many proofs of the external world, like, for example, I'm standing closer to the wall than to the fireplace. Right? Or we might take some examples from J.L. Austin. I live in York Springs. Right? Now, those things, if there is no external world, those things cannot be true. And yet they are true. If they are true, then there is an external world. And guess what? You believe stuff like that all the time. So you believe there is an external world in your capacity as a philosopher, as you might put it, or in any other capacity, because you don't have ultra superhuman capacities, or you don't doubt as a philosopher, which you're completely committed to all through there as a human being. That actually makes no sense. I mean, that's just some kind of strange hypocrisy. All right. Wittgenstein says stuff like this with regard to here is a hand and here is another. If I know that here is a hand and here is another. This is proposition 58 of uncertainty. If I know is conceived as a grammatical proposition, of course the I cannot be important. And it properly means there is no such thing as a doubt in this case. Or the expression I do not know makes no sense in this case. And of course it follows from this that I know makes no sense either. Okay, so doubting that here is a hand and here is another, under the circumstances described by Moore, like waving them around as he gives a lecture. He can't, because he can't fail to know it. He can't know it. If that's how I'm construing Wittgenstein. Or he says at 59, I know is here a logical insight. Only realism can't be proved by means of it. So he gives, Wittgenstein attributes to claims like here is a hand and here is another, or I live in York Springs, or whatever. I call those M sentences, Moore sentences. Sentences from which the existence of the external world follows. All right? Wittgenstein gives those sentences the status of grammatical or logical propositions. They are rules of the game. Right? And he says, I know means there is no such thing as doubt in this case. He says that boldly. Now, one thing I want to say is that here is a hand and here is another, or I live in York Springs, all right, or there's my cat. These are not grammatical or logical propositions, and I don't know how such a notion would occur to anybody. These are the most ordinary empirical propositions, okay? You're going to have to explain to me why they're grammatical or logical. It's simply because they are exempted from justification. These are things I know that I do not have to produce a justification for, in which in some cases I could not produce a justification for, and yet in which it is appropriate to claim that I do know. And this is true of many or most ordinary things that I do know. So, say I have to justify the claim that I live in York Springs. Especially if I have to justify it in terms of my sense contents or, sense experiences or something like that, empirically. Well, I suppose that encompasses the whole of the process by which I negotiated the mortgage, moved in, and then failed to move out for 5 years. It includes my whole sensorium for the past 6 years, actually. Right? So there's your justification. No, the demand for justification is inappropriate, except under very special circumstances for claims like this. And that doesn't mean they're logical or grammatical. It's just that Wittgenstein has this fantastic theory of knowledge, which unfortunately is the theory of knowledge more or less of the entire tradition. That knowledge has certainty because it has justification, has rational justification. Wittgenstein appears to require extremely rigorous rational justification, like there is no such thing as doubt. So these things can't count as knowledge. Here's a hand and here's another can't count as knowledge, like empirical knowledge, because the demand for justification is inappropriate. So, and yet they're true in some sense. No, they're true in the sense that they are the content that make the rules of the game, or that are they have grammatical or logical status. You could not possibly make that move unless you had just cornered yourself by extremely bad theories. And the first of those is knowledge requires justification. So as I started arguing in the early 90s, I was among the few, or I was the only perhaps philosopher actually arguing in journals and so on, that the justification condition on knowledge ought merely to be deleted. That whatever's true and that we believe, we know. So, then we have to mess with truth, as in the previous video or whatever. So I argue that again. I mean, really, the epistemology chapter incorporates my work on epistemology from the early 90s, when I kind of partly specialized in that area for some years, and did, argue that knowledge is merely true belief. The other main doctrine that I endorse here, and it's very much connected, I think these things go together beautifully, is extended mind thesis, as Andy Clark expresses it, or as I saw much earlier from Mark Rowlands, externalism with regard to mental content. I published a paper on this in '95, which was fairly early to the game, but I had read Rowlands by then. And this is the idea that our mental content is not contained in our skulls. It's not a matter of brain events. It's not merely a matter of brain events, much less events in the representational world we supposedly create or whatever, or our mere linguistic structures or something like that. Our mental life encompasses, or perhaps even our mind encompasses, external objects. That's very much in keeping with the entire ontological orientation of this book, and it's very much in keeping with I think, with deleting the justification condition. Okay, we are not these rational reasoning. We're not reasoning machines. We're organisms in an environment, okay, which we know and we must know in order to survive. And we know it in various ways and, through various inputs. And we are not fully distinct from the environment that we inhabit. Perception, which of course is closely related to knowledge, that has to be detailed, obviously, is a very difficult set of issues arise there. As I've argued, is an interpenetration of organism and environment. That we should understand perception on the model of ingestion or respiration, in which we cease to be fully distinct from elements of our environment. So in perception, I believe, our mental content literally encompasses the external world directly. Right? And I agree with Rowlands and Clark and others that, for example, memory uses in all sorts of elaborate ways external props, that our act of remembering often encompasses objects that enable us to remember, even if it's books or, the internet or something, whatever it may be. All right. So, I guess I put forward this set of positions in the early 90s, and I returned to them to some extent, although the presentation is fundamentally the same. One problem that I raised originally in '91 for the late '80s, actually, in grad school, for theories of knowledge that do impose a justification condition, or at least a certain range of them, is what came to be known as the swamping problem, which is that essentially our goal is met if we have true belief. Truth is built into the nature of belief. To believe is to take something to be true. And if we arrive at truth with regard to any proposition that we are considering, let's not worry about propositions for a moment, then we've arrived at the epistemic goal with regard to that proposition. And knowledge is the epistemic goal. That is, we've arrived at knowledge. Hence, knowledge is true belief. Right? That's sweeping the swamping problem up into an argument for something wider than it's been used for in the literature. I will insist that I invented that sucker, though. All right, I guess that's it for this one. Next, we're going to do some free will and stuff in ethics.